When Irish widow Katherine O'Brien fled Chicago with her young son, she thought answering a mail-order bride advertisement would give them a fresh start in Texas. Instead, she walked straight into another deadly trap, one that threatened not just her freedom, but her child's life. What she didn't know was that salvation would come from an unexpected source, a scarred Union Army captain who had sworn never to trust his heart again. This is a story of courage born from desperation, healing found in the most broken places, and the power of love to overcome even the darkest secrets. Two wounded souls, one innocent child in a conspiracy that reaches from the streets of Chicago to the frontier towns of Texas. If you believe in second chances, in the healing power of true love, you won't want to miss a single moment of this incredible journey. Hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more unforgettable stories of hope, healing, and the triumph of the human spirit. Irish widow escapes Chicago murder plot, finds love with traumatized Union Army captain. In Texas. The blood on Patrick O'Brien's collar was still warm when Katherine found his body in their small Chicago apartment. Her hands shook as she pressed her fingers to his neck, searching for a pulse she knew she would not find. Her husband of 10 years, her partner in the small accounting business they had built together, was gone. But there was no time for grief. Not yet. Mama, 10-year-old Danny's voice came from the doorway, small and frightened. Papa won't wake up. Katherine's heart shattered at the innocence in her son's voice, but she forced herself to move with practiced efficiency. She had seen death before, too much of it during the war years, when she had worked as a nurse while Patrick served with the Irish Brigade. She knew the signs, and she knew they had to leave. Now. Danny, go pack your clothes, only what fits in your school bag. Katherine's voice was steady despite the terror coursing through her veins. Quickly now, love. But Mama, what about Papa? Papa's gone to be with the angels, Danny, and we have to go too before the bad men come back. Katherine had discovered the corruption 3 days earlier. As the bookkeeper for Patrick's small accounting firm, she had noticed discrepancies in the police pension fund records. Money disappearing, false entries, payments to men who didn't exist. When she had shared her findings with Patrick, he had promised to investigate quietly, carefully. Clearly, he had not been careful enough. As she threw their few precious belongings into a worn carpet bag, Katherine's mind raced through their limited options. They had little money, no family in America, and now no one they could trust. The corruption reached high into the Chicago Police Department, high enough to order the murder of an honest accountant who had stumbled onto their scheme. It was then that she remembered the letter. She found it in Patrick's desk drawer, crumpled but still legible. A response to some inquiry he had made months earlier, back when their business was failing and their prospects seemed dim. The letter was from someone named Mayor Silas Blackwood in a place called Dusty Creek, Texas, seeking respectable widow for marriage to successful Texas rancher. The letter read, comfortable circumstances, good prospects for family man, references available upon request. Katherine had dismissed it as foolishness when Patrick first showed it to her. She had been a married woman then, with a husband, in a business, in a future that seemed secure. Now, with Patrick's blood growing cold in the next room and the sound of heavy footsteps echoing in the hallway outside, that letter looked like salvation. Danny, come here. Katherine knelt before her son, taking his small face in her hands. We're going on a journey, love, a long one, and we might have to pretend to be different people for a while. Danny's blue eyes, so like his father's, searched her face with an intelligence that was far too old for his years. Like a game, Mama. Yes, exactly like a game. Can you be very brave for me? Danny nodded solemnly, though Katherine could see the fear he was trying to hide. At 10 years old, he had already learned that the world could be a dangerous place for people like them. Irish, poor, and honest in a city where those qualities were often more liability than asset. They slipped out of the building through the back entrance, Katherine's heart pounding with every step. The streets of Chicago's South Side were dangerous even in daylight, but they were doubly so for a woman and child fleeing for their lives. Katherine pulled her shawl closer around her shoulders and kept Danny close to her side as they made their way toward the train station. The journey to Texas took 3 days and consumed nearly every penny Katherine had managed to save over the years. She bought passage under the name she intended to use in her new life, Ms. Mary O'Sullivan, Irish widow, seeking a fresh start in the American West. It was close enough to her real name that she could respond naturally, but different enough that anyone searching for Katherine O'Brien might not make the connection. As the train carried them away from Chicago and toward an uncertain future, Katherine held Danny close and tried not to think about the life they were leaving behind. Patrick had been a good man, an honest man, and he had died because he could not tolerate seeing corruption go unpunished. Now she and Danny would have to build new lives with new names, always looking over their shoulders, always wondering if the past had finally caught up with them. The letter from Mayor Blackwood promised a successful Texas rancher seeking a wife, but Katherine had learned enough about such arrangements to harbor few illusions. Mail-order bride advertisements were often placed by men who could not find wives through conventional means. Men who were too old, too poor, too crude, or too isolated to attract women locally. Still, even an unpleasant husband might provide the protection and stability that she and Danny desperately needed. What she did not expect when she stepped off the train in the dusty depot of Dusty Creek, Texas, was to find herself face to face with corruption that rivaled anything she had fled in Chicago. Mayor Silas Blackwood was waiting on the platform when the train arrived, a well-dressed man of middle years, with the kind of smooth charm that immediately put Katherine on guard. She had dealt with enough politicians and bureaucrats to recognize the type. Men who smiled easily and spoke eloquently while their hands moved through other people's pockets. "Mrs. O'Sullivan, I presume?" Blackwood's smile was as polished as his appearance, but his eyes held a calculating coldness that reminded Katherine uncomfortably of the Chicago police officers who had begun asking questions about Patrick's work. "Yes," Katherine replied cautiously. "Mayor Blackwood." "Indeed. Welcome to Dusty Creek, my dear lady. I trust your journey was not too arduous." Katherine had expected to meet the rancher who had supposedly placed the advertisement, but Blackwood's presence suggested a different arrangement entirely. "I was expecting to meet Mr." She paused, realizing that the advertisement had never actually mentioned the rancher's name. "Ah, yes. Well, there has been a slight change in circumstances," Blackwood said smoothly, taking her arm and guiding her toward a waiting carriage. "The gentleman in question has unfortunately found himself otherwise engaged. However, I believe I can offer you an even more advantageous arrangement." Danny pressed closer to Katherine's side, his child's instincts obviously alerting him to something wrong with the situation. Katherine felt her own alarm bells ringing as Blackwood's grip on her arm tightened just enough to suggest that resistance would not be welcomed. "What sort of arrangement?" Katherine asked, though she was beginning to suspect she already knew. "Why, marriage to myself, of course," Blackwood replied as if this were the most natural thing in the world. "I am, after all, the mayor of our fair town, a position that comes with considerable influence and prosperity. You could hardly hope for a more suitable husband." As the carriage rolled through the streets of Dusty Creek, Katherine assessed her situation with the same analytical mind that had served her well as an accountant. She was hundreds of miles from Chicago, with a young son to protect and almost no money left. She had no friends, no connections, and no legal recourse if Blackwood chose to make trouble for her. Once again, she found herself trapped by circumstances beyond her control. But she had escaped one trap already. Perhaps she could escape another. Dusty Creek was larger than Katherine had expected, a prosperous frontier town with substantial buildings and busy streets. The mayor's house, where Blackwood took them for refreshments and discussion, was an imposing two-story structure that spoke of wealth and influence. But Katherine had learned to look beyond surface appearances, and what she saw in the mayor's home made her increasingly uneasy. The servants were nervous, jumping at shadows and avoiding eye contact. The house itself, while expensively furnished, had an air of impermanence about it, as if its owner expected to leave on short notice. And Blackwood himself, despite his smooth manners and political charm, had the predatory stillness of a man accustomed to getting his way through intimidation rather than persuasion. "Now then, Mrs. O'Sullivan," Blackwood said as they settled in his elegantly appointed sitting room, "let us discuss your situation candidly. You are a woman alone with a child to support, seeking marriage for security rather than romance. I am a man of influence seeking a respectable wife to enhance my political standing. We can be of mutual benefit to each other. And if I choose not to accept your proposal?" Katherine asked, though she suspected the answer would not be pleasant. Blackwood's smile never wavered, but his eyes grew cold. "My dear lady, you have traveled a great distance at considerable expense to accept a marriage proposal. It would be most unfortunate if you were to find yourself stranded in an unfamiliar place with limited resources. The frontier can be quite dangerous for women and children without proper protection. The threat was politely phrased but unmistakable. Catherine felt Danny's small hand slip into hers, and she squeezed it gently, drawing strength from her son's trust in her ability to protect them both. I would need time to consider, Catherine said carefully. Such an important decision should not be made hastily. Of course, Blackwood agreed readily. I have arranged accommodations for you at the hotel. You may have until tomorrow evening to reach your decision. As they were escorted to the Dusty Creek Hotel, Catherine's mind was already working on alternatives. She had not survived the streets of Chicago and the death of her husband by accepting defeat easily. There had to be another way, another option, another path to safety for herself and Danny. She just had to find it before Mayor Blackwood's patience ran out. That evening, as Catherine tucked Danny into the narrow hotel bed they would share, her son surprised her with a question that revealed just how much he had understood of their desperate circumstances. Mama, are we going to have to stay with the bad man? Catherine smoothed Danny's dark hair, so like Patrick's, and considered how much truth a 10-year-old could bear. What makes you think he's a bad man, love? He smiles like the policemen back home, the ones who made Papa scared. The observation chilled Catherine to the bone. If Danny, with his child's instinct for danger, had picked up on the same predatory quality that set her own nerves on edge, then her assessment of Blackwood was probably correct. They were not safe here, perhaps no safer than they had been in Chicago. We're going to find another way, Catherine promised, though she had no idea what that way might be. I won't let anyone hurt you, Danny, I promise. But as she lay awake that night, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the frontier town and feeling the weight of impossible choices pressing down on her, Katherine O'Brien wondered if she was making promises she would not be able to keep. The next morning brought unexpected hope in the form of a chance encounter outside the hotel. Catherine was walking with Danny, trying to get a better sense of the town and its people, when a commotion in the street caught their attention. A man was having trouble with his horse, a spirited bay mare that seemed determined to test every ounce of her rider's skill and patience. What caught Catherine's attention was not the horse's behavior, but the man's response to it. Despite his obvious frustration, he spoke to the animal with gentle firmness, his movements calm and controlled, even as the mare danced and shied beneath him. Easy girl, the man murmured, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. No one's going to hurt you. Just settle down now. Something in his tone, patient, kind understanding of fear and the need for trust, made Catherine pause in her walking. This was not the voice of a man who controlled through intimidation or force. This was someone who understood that some things once broken required careful healing. The horse finally settled, responding to the man's quiet persistence rather than any show of dominance. As he dismounted and began checking his gear, Catherine got her first clear look at him. He was tall and lean, with the weathered look of someone who spent his days outdoors. His clothes were simple but well-maintained, speaking of someone who took pride in his appearance without vanity. Dark hair showed beneath his hat, and when he turned slightly in her direction, she could see a face that was marked by both strength and sorrow. But it was his eyes that stopped Catherine's breath in her throat. They were the eyes of someone who had seen too much, suffered too much, lost too much. They were eyes that understood pain in ways that went deeper than physical injury. Mama, Danny whispered, he's got a hurt arm. Catherine looked more closely and saw what her son had noticed immediately. The man's left sleeve hung oddly, and when he moved to adjust his saddle, she could see that his left arm ended just below the elbow. A war wound almost certainly, and probably a recent one, given the way he had learned to compensate for its absence. Stay here, Danny, Catherine said quietly, making a decision that surprised even her. She approached the man carefully, unsure of what she intended to say, but knowing instinctively that here was someone who might understand the kind of desperation that drove good people to make impossible choices. Excuse me? She said softly, not wanting to startle him. The man turned, and Catherine found herself looking into eyes the color of storm clouds over the Irish Sea. They were wary but not hostile, tired but not defeated. They were the eyes of someone who had learned to be cautious but had not yet given up on the possibility of kindness in the world. Yes, ma'am. His voice held the trace of an accent she could not quite place, overlaid with the careful courtesy of a man who had been raised to respect women but had learned not to trust easily. I'm sorry to bother you, but I wonder if you might be able to tell me about employment opportunities in the area. For women, I mean, respectable employment. The man's eyes sharpened with interest and perhaps concern. You're looking for work, ma'am. I am. My husband passed recently, and my son and I are in need of honest employment. I can keep books, cook clean, manage a household. I'm not afraid of hard work. The man glanced toward Danny, who was watching them with bright, curious eyes, then back to Catherine. Might I ask your name, ma'am? Catherine hesitated for just a moment, then decided to trust her instincts. Katherine O'Sullivan, Kate, and that's my son, Danny. Cole Mitchell, the man replied, touching his hat brim politely. I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. O'Sullivan. The frontier can be hard on families. There was something in the way he said it that suggested personal experience with loss, and Catherine felt her heart go out to this quiet, courteous man who seemed to carry his own burden of grief. Are you from around here, Mr. Mitchell? Catherine asked, though she was already beginning to hope that he might represent the alternative to Blackwood that she so desperately needed to find. I have a ranch about 15 miles north of town. Small operation, but it keeps me busy. Cole hesitated, then seemed to make a decision of his own. Mrs. O'Sullivan, forgive me if this seems presumptuous, but you seem like you might be in some kind of trouble. If there's anything I can do to help. Catherine felt tears prick at her eyes at the simple kindness in his offer. When had someone last offered to help her without expecting something in return? When had anyone looked at her with simple human concern rather than calculation or threat? That's very kind of you, Mr. Mitchell. We're in a difficult situation, and I'm trying to find the best path forward for my son. Cole nodded as if he understood far more than she had said. Sometimes the best path isn't the most obvious one. If you'd like to talk about it, I'll be having coffee at the cafe across the street in about an hour. You and your boy would be welcome to join me. It was carefully phrased, offering help without pressure, providing an opportunity without obligation. Catherine realized that Cole Mitchell was giving her exactly what she needed most, a choice that was truly her own to make. Thank you, she said softly. I think we'd like that very much. As Cole tipped his hat and continued about his business, Catherine felt something she had not experienced since Patrick's death. Hope. Not the desperate hope of someone with no options, but the genuine hope of someone who had found an unexpected possibility for kindness in a harsh world. She did not yet know that Cole Mitchell carried scars that went far deeper than his missing arm, or that his offer of help was born from his own desperate need to believe that good still existed in the world. She did not know that her simple request for assistance would challenge everything he had told himself about the wisdom of isolation and the safety of emotional distance. All she knew was that for the first time since fleeing Chicago, she had met someone who looked at her and saw a person worthy of respect and assistance rather than a target for exploitation. And that, Catherine thought as she walked back toward Danny, was enough to build a new life on. An hour later, Catherine sat in the modest cafe across from Cole Mitchell, watching him interact with her son over coffee and pie. Danny, who had been suspicious and withdrawn since Patrick's death, was beginning to warm to the quiet rancher's patient attention. Cole listened to Danny's questions about cattle and horses with the same seriousness he might give to adult conversation, treating the boy as an individual worthy of respect. So you've never seen a real cowboy before? Cole asked Danny, a hint of amusement softening his weathered features. No, sir, just in pictures. Danny's eyes were bright with curiosity. Do you really rope cattle and fight outlaws? Well, I do rope cattle when they need doctoring or branding, Cole replied thoughtfully. As for fighting outlaws, I try to avoid trouble when I can. A smart man doesn't go looking for fights. Catherine found herself relaxing as she watched the interaction. Cole Mitchell had the rare gift of speaking to children without condescension, treating Danny's questions as legitimate inquiries rather than childish prattling. It was a quality she had always valued in Patrick, and seeing it in this stranger made her heart ache with both grief and hope. Mrs. O'Sullivan, Cole said, turning his attention to Catherine, while keeping one eye on Danny, who was absorbed in his pie. You mentioned you were looking for employment. Might I ask what kind of situation you were trying to escape? Catherine had debated how much to tell him, but something in Cole's manner suggested that he was no stranger to difficult circumstances. My husband discovered some irregularities in the accounts he was managing. Men in authority positions were stealing money, and when Patrick tried to expose them, they killed him. Cole's expression grew very still. And you and the boy, we fled, changed our names, came here hoping to start fresh. Catherine's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. But I think we may have jumped from the fire into the frying pan. Blackwood, Cole said, and it wasn't a question. Catherine's head snapped up in surprise. You know about him? Cole's jaw tightened with what looked like old anger. Silas Blackwood has been placing advertisements for mail-order brides for the better part of 2 years. Young women come to town expecting to marry respectable ranchers and then disappear, or end up working in circumstances that no decent woman would choose willingly. Dear God, Catherine breathed. How many? At least 5 that I know of, probably more. Cole's voice was flat with controlled fury. Local law enforcement won't investigate because Blackwood has too much influence. Federal marshals say it's a local matter unless someone can prove the women were transported across state lines against their will. Catherine felt the blood drain from her face as she realized how close she and Danny had come to becoming Blackwood's latest victims. He expects an answer tonight. Marriage to him or consequences, Cole finished grimly. That's his usual method. Danny looked up from his pie, sensing the tension in the adult conversation. Mama, are you talking about the bad man from yesterday? Yes, love, Catherine said softly, reaching out to smooth his hair. But don't worry, we're figuring out how to stay safe. Cole studied Danny's serious face for a moment, then looked back at Catherine. Mrs. O'Sullivan, I have a proposition for you. Nothing improper, he added quickly, seeing her alarmed expression. My ranch needs a housekeeper, someone to cook, clean, manage the household accounts. The pay isn't much, but it includes room and board for both you and Danny. You'd be safe there, and it would give you time to decide what you want to do next. Catherine stared at him, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. Mr. Mitchell, why would you do that? You don't know anything about us. Cole was quiet for a long moment, his storm gray eyes distant with some painful memory. Let's just say I understand what it's like to need a second chance, he said finally. And I believe everyone deserves the opportunity to build something better from the pieces of what came before. There was a weight of personal experience behind those words that Catherine recognized. Whatever had cost Cole Mitchell his arm had taken more than just limb. It had carved away pieces of his soul that were still healing. Perhaps that was why he could offer kindness without expectation, understanding without judgment. There is one thing you should know. Cole continued, his voice careful and measured. I was a soldier during the war. Union cavalry. I don't do well with crowds or loud noises or unexpected situations. Some days are better than others. If you're looking for someone cheerful and sociable, you'd be better off looking elsewhere. Catherine saw through his warning to the vulnerability beneath it. Cole Mitchell was giving her the chance to reject him before she could discover his weaknesses and use them against him. It was the self-protection of someone who had been hurt badly enough to expect the worst from human nature. Mr. Mitchell, Catherine said gently, my husband was a Union soldier too, with the Irish Brigade. I spent 2 years nursing wounded men in field hospitals during the war. I understand about difficult days and hard memories. Something shifted in Cole's expression. Surprise, perhaps, or relief. Then you know that sometimes the wounds that don't show are the hardest to heal. Yes, Catherine said softly, I know. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, each recognizing a kindred spirit in the other. 2 people who had been broken by circumstances beyond their control, learning to build new lives from the fragments that remained. So, Cole said finally, what do you say? Would you be willing to take a chance on a one-armed rancher with a bad case of war nerves? Catherine felt tears threatening as she realized that this man, this good, damaged, generous man, was offering her exactly what she had prayed for, but never dared hope she would find. Not just safety, but dignity. Not just employment, but respect. Mr. Mitchell, she said, her voice thick with emotion, I think that would be the best decision I've made in a very long time. Cole's smile was small but genuine, And for the first time, Katherine could see the man he must have been before the war carved away his easy confidence. Then let's get you and Danny out of town before Blackwood realizes what's happening. The next few hours moved with the swift efficiency of a military operation. Cole had clearly learned something about tactical planning during his Army days, because he approached their departure from Dusty Creek with the methodical care of someone who understood the importance of preparation and contingency planning. First, he escorted Katherine and Danny to the general store, where he purchased supplies under the guise of normal ranch provisioning. Katherine added her few belongings to his purchases, making it appear that she was simply helping him shop, rather than preparing to leave town permanently. "Won't people think it's strange that you're buying women's clothing and children's books?" Katherine asked quietly as Cole paid for their purchases. "They'll think I'm finally taking their advice about finding a wife," Cole replied with a slight smile. "Half the town has been trying to matchmake for me since I got back from the war. They'll be too pleased to ask difficult questions." Next, Cole arranged for Katherine to send a carefully worded telegram to family back east, informing them of her change of plans. The message was designed to create a paper trail showing that Katherine O'Sullivan had left Dusty Creek voluntarily heading further west rather than remaining to marry Mayor Blackwood. "If Blackwood tries to claim you were kidnapped or coerced, this will provide evidence to the contrary," Cole explained as they left the telegraph office. "It's not much, but it might be enough to keep him from pursuing the matter legally." Finally, Cole visited the hotel to settle Katherine's bill and informed the desk clerk that Mrs. O'Sullivan had decided to continue her journey westward. He left a sealed envelope containing a polite note, declining Mayor Blackwood's proposal, citing her decision to join family in California. "Will he believe it?" Katherine asked as they loaded their purchases into Cole's wagon. "Probably not," Cole admitted, "but it gives us a few hours head start and it establishes a legal record of your intentions. That might be important later." As they drove out of Dusty Creek in the late afternoon sunshine, Katherine felt a mixture of relief and anxiety that was becoming familiar. Once again, she was fleeing toward an uncertain future with her son's welfare dependent on her ability to judge the character of someone she barely knew. But this time felt different. This time she was not running toward a trap disguised as salvation, but toward a genuine offer of honest employment with a man who had shown her nothing but respect and kindness. Cole's ranch was exactly what Katherine had expected from her assessment of his character. Modest but well-maintained, functional rather than flashy, built for comfort and efficiency rather than display. The main house was a simple two-story structure with a wide porch and large windows that let in plenty of natural light. Outbuildings were in good repair. Corrals were sturdy, and everything spoke of a man who took pride in his work, even if he worked alone. "It's not much to look at," Cole said as he helped Katherine and Danny down from the wagon, "but it's peaceful and it's safe." Katherine looked around at the rolling hills and big sky, breathing in the clean air that carried the sense of grass and cattle and growing things. After the cramped, smoky streets of Chicago and the threatening atmosphere of Dusty Creek, the ranch felt like paradise. "It's beautiful," she said honestly. "It feels like home." Cole's expression softened at her words. "I hope you'll still feel that way after you've been here a while. Ranch life can be lonely, especially for someone used to city living." "Mr. Mitchell," Katherine said, turning to face him directly, "I've lived in cities all my life, and I've never been lonelier than I was there. Sometimes being around people just makes the emptiness worse." Cole nodded as if he understood exactly what she meant. "Well, you won't have that problem here. The nearest neighbor is 10 miles away, and the closest thing to entertainment is watching the sunset." "Mama, look!" Danny's excited voice drew their attention to the corral, where several horses were watching the newcomers with intelligent curiosity. "Are those really yours, Mr. Mitchell?" "They are indeed," Cole replied, his face brightening at Danny's enthusiasm. "That bay mare is Duchess. She's the one who was giving me trouble in town. The black gelding is Thunder and the paint is called Patches. Would you like to meet them properly?" As Cole introduced Danny to the horses with the same patience and respect he had shown in town, Katherine felt something in her chest loosen for the first time since Patrick's death. This was what she had hoped to find when she answered that fateful advertisement. Not just safety, but the possibility of building a real life, a real home. That evening, as Katherine prepared their first supper in the ranch kitchen, she marveled at how natural it felt to be cooking for Cole and Danny. The kitchen was well-equipped and thoughtfully arranged, suggesting that its previous occupant had taken pride in the domestic arts. Catherine wondered about the woman who had planned this space, who had chosen the cheerful yellow paint and carefully positioned the windows to catch the morning light. "This is wonderful," Cole said as they sat down to a simple meal of stew and biscuits. "I haven't had cooking this good since—" He paused, his expression growing distant. "Since your wife?" Catherine asked gently. Cole's jaw tightened slightly. "I was never married. My sister used to cook for me, but she moved back east after I came home from the war. Said the frontier was too isolated for her taste." Catherine heard the pain behind his carefully neutral words and recognized the familiar ache of abandonment. Someone Cole had counted on had chosen to leave rather than stay and help him heal. It was a betrayal that cut deeper than any physical wound. "Well," Catherine said lightly, not wanting to press on what was obviously a sensitive subject, "I'm grateful for the opportunity to put my domestic skills to good use. It feels wonderful to have a real kitchen to work in again." Over the following days, Catherine threw herself into the work of making Cole's house into a home. She cleaned and organized with the methodical efficiency that had served her well in her accounting work, but she also added small touches that spoke of feminine care and attention. Wildflowers in mason jars, curtains to soften the stark window frames, the smell of fresh bread and simmering stews that filled the house with warmth. Cole seemed almost bewildered by the transformation. He would stop in doorways looking around as if he couldn't quite believe the changes, then catch himself and retreat to the safer territory of barn and pasture. Catherine understood that he was overwhelmed by having his solitary space invaded even by invited guests, and she tried to give him room to adjust. Danny, meanwhile, was thriving in ways that broke Catherine's heart with gratitude. The serious, frightened child who had barely spoken since his father's death was beginning to emerge from his shell under Cole's patient tutelage. The rancher seemed to instinctively understand that Danny needed gentle encouragement rather than pressure, meaningful work rather than mindless entertainment. "Can I help with the horses today, Mr. Mitchell?" Danny asked each morning, and Cole always found age-appropriate tasks that made the boy feel useful and important. Catherine watched them together with a mixture of joy and sadness. Joy, because Danny was beginning to heal from the trauma that had marked his young life. Sadness, because she could see how much he was growing to love this quiet, damaged man who treated him with such careful kindness. What would happen when it came time to move on? Because surely this was temporary, this peaceful interlude between disasters. Catherine had learned not to trust in happiness or stability. They were luxuries that women like her could not afford to depend upon. But as the days stretched into weeks, Catherine began to allow herself to hope that perhaps, just perhaps, they had finally found a place where they could belong. It was during her third week at the ranch that Catherine made the discovery that would change everything. She had been organizing Cole's papers, trying to bring some order to his haphazard record-keeping when she found the letters. They were hidden in the back of a desk drawer, tied with a faded ribbon, and Catherine might have simply returned them to their hiding place if she hadn't recognized the letterhead. Chicago Police Department, Pension Bureau. Her hands trembling. Catherine untied the ribbon and began to read. What she found made her sink into a chair, her heart hammering with a mixture of terror and desperate hope. The letters were correspondence between Cole Mitchell and various officials in Chicago, dating back nearly a year. Cole had been investigating the same pension fund corruption that had cost Patrick his life. He had been working with federal authorities, gathering evidence, building a case against the very men who had murdered her husband. The most recent letter was dated just 2 weeks before Catherine and Danny's arrival at the ranch. It was from a federal marshal named Samuel Hayes, and it contained information that took Catherine's breath away. "Mr. Mitchell, your information about the pension fund irregularities has been invaluable in building our case. We now have sufficient evidence to move against the corruption ring, but we still need the testimony of Patrick O'Brien's widow. We believe she may have access to financial records that could complete our case. Any information you can provide about her whereabouts would be greatly appreciated." Catherine read the letter 3 times before its full implications sank in. Cole Mitchell was not just offering her sanctuary, he was offering her justice. He was offering her the chance to ensure that Patrick's death had meaning, that the men who had killed him would face the consequences of their crimes. But how long had he known who she really was, and why hadn't he said anything? The sound of boots on the front porch announced Cole's return from the pasture. Katherine quickly retied the letters and returned them to their hiding place, her mind racing with questions and possibilities. Katherine, Cole's voice carried a note of concern. Is everything all right? You look like you've seen a ghost. Katherine turned to face him, studying his weathered features with new understanding. Cole, I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth. Cole's expression grew wary, but he nodded. All right. How long have you known who I really am? Cole was very still for a long moment, his storm gray eyes searching her face. Since the day we met in town, he said finally, you match the description in the federal marshal's letters exactly. Irish widow with a 10-year-old son fleeing Chicago under an assumed name after her husband was murdered for investigating police corruption. Katherine felt a chill of fear and betrayal wash over her. Then why didn't you say anything? Why didn't you turn me over to the authorities? Because, Cole said quietly, I've learned the difference between justice and revenge. The federal marshals want to use you to build their case, but they're not particularly concerned about your safety or Danny's welfare. I thought you deserved the chance to make your own choice about whether to help them. Katherine stared at him, hardly able to believe what she was hearing. You mean you've been protecting me even though helping the federal marshals would further your own investigation? Katherine, Cole said, stepping closer, his voice gentle but firm. The investigation matters, but not more than you and Danny do. Not more than giving you the chance to build a safe, stable life after everything you've been through. Katherine felt tears burning her eyes as the full weight of his sacrifice became clear. Cole Mitchell had risked his own quest for justice in order to protect two strangers who had stumbled into his life. He had offered them sanctuary not because he needed their help, but because they needed his. The men who killed Patrick, Katherine said shakily, they're still free, still hurting other people. They are, Cole agreed, but that's not your fault, and it's not your responsibility to fix it. You've already lost enough to their greed and corruption. Katherine looked into Cole's eyes and saw the truth that had been growing between them for weeks, acknowledged by neither but felt by both. This was no longer about employer and employee, or even about protector and protected. This was about two broken people who had found healing in each other's company, two hearts that had learned to hope again despite every reason for despair. What if I wanted to help? Katherine asked quietly. What if I wanted to make sure they face justice for what they did to Patrick, to all the families they've hurt? Cole's expression grew troubled. Katherine testifying against them would be dangerous. They've already killed once to protect their secrets. If they knew you were alive and talking to federal marshals, then I'd need protection, Katherine said, her voice growing stronger with conviction. I'd need someone I could trust to keep me and Danny safe while I did what needed to be done. Cole searched in her face, looking for any sign of doubt or fear. Are you sure about this? Once you contact the marshals, there's no going back. Your quiet life here would be over. Katherine thought about Patrick, about the other families that had been hurt by the corruption he had died trying to expose. She thought about the strength she had found in herself over the past weeks, the courage that had grown from Cole's steady support and Danny's need for justice. I'm sure, she said finally, but I can't do it alone. Cole nodded slowly, understanding, passing between them without need for words. Then we'll do it together, he said simply. All three of us. As Cole went to compose a telegram to Federal Marshal Hayes, Katherine felt the last pieces of her heart settle into place. She had found not just safety or employment or even love, but something rarer and more precious. A true partner, someone who would stand with her through whatever battles lay ahead. Justice for Patrick, safety for Danny, and hope for a future she was finally brave enough to fight for. The federal marshals arrived at Cole's ranch 3 days later, just as the autumn sun was painting the Texas hills in shades of gold and crimson. Katherine watched from the kitchen window as two dusty riders approached the house, her heart hammering, with a mixture of anticipation and dread. Remember, Cole said quietly, moving to stand beside her, you're in control here. They need your testimony, which means they need your cooperation. Don't let them pressure you into anything you're not comfortable with. Katherine nodded, drawing strength from his steady presence. Over the past 3 days, as they had waited for the marshal's arrival, she and Cole had spent long hours planning for this moment. They had reviewed the financial records she had saved, discussed the details of Patrick's investigation, and prepared for the difficult questions that were sure to come. But more than that, they had talked about their future. The growing connection between them could no longer be ignored or dismissed as gratitude and convenience. What had begun as a business arrangement, Mena, had become something deeper, more precious, and infinitely more complicated. Mrs. O'Brien. The lead marshal was a tall, weathered man with kind eyes and the careful manner of someone accustomed to dealing with frightened witnesses. I'm Marshal Samuel Hayes. This is my partner, Marshal Tom Rodriguez. We're very grateful that you've agreed to help us with this investigation. Catherine invited the marshals into the house, noting how Cole positioned himself where he could watch both the lawmen and the approaches to the ranch. His military training was showing, and she found his protective instincts both touching and reassuring. Before we begin, Catherine said as they settled around the kitchen table, I need to know exactly what you're asking of me and what protections you can provide for my son and myself. Marshal Hayes nodded approvingly. You're wise to ask. The corruption we're investigating goes deep into the Chicago Police Department and city government. The men involved have shown they're willing to kill to protect their operation. That's why we've been so careful about contacting you. What we need, Marshal Rodriguez added, is your testimony about your husband's investigation and any financial records he may have shared with you. We also need you to identify the men who threatened him before his death. Catherine felt Cole's reassuring presence beside her as she considered the marshal's request. What about afterward, when the trials are over, what happens to Danny and me? That would depend on the outcomes of the trials, Hayes said carefully. If the defendants are convicted and imprisoned, you should be safe to resume normal lives wherever you choose. If not, he shrugged grimly. If not, we'd be looking over our shoulders for the rest of our lives, Catherine finished. Just like we are now. I'm afraid so, Hayes admitted. That's why it's crucial that we build the strongest possible case. Your testimony could be the key to putting these men away permanently. Cole leaned forward slightly. What about protection during the investigation and trials? Mrs. O'Brien and her son can't just walk into a Chicago courtroom undefended. We've arranged for safe houses and federal protection, Rodriguez assured them. Mrs. O'Brien and the boy would be completely secure throughout the legal proceedings. Catherine saw Cole's jaw tighten at the mention of safe houses. She understood his concern. Federal protection would mean separation from him, perhaps for months. It would mean leaving the safety and peace they had built together for the uncertainty of hiding and waiting and hoping that justice would prevail. How long would the trials take? Catherine asked. Hard to say, Hayes replied. Could be 6 months, could be a year or more if there are appeals. These cases are complicated, and the defendants have expensive lawyers. Catherine closed her eyes and tried to imagine a year of hiding, a year of keeping Danny sequestered, and fearful a year of separation from the man who had become so much more than an employer. When she opened her eyes, she found Cole watching her with an expression of understanding and resignation. Marshal Hayes, Cole said quietly, could I have a private word with Mrs. O'Brien? The marshals exchanged glances, then nodded and stepped out onto the porch to give them privacy. Catherine turned to face Cole, already knowing what he was going to say. You have to go, Cole said simply. You know that, don't you? I know, Catherine whispered, though the words felt like physical pain. But Cole, what if something happens? What if the protection isn't enough? What if Cole reached out and took her hands in his touch gentle but firm? Catherine, listen to me. You're the bravest woman I've ever known. You fled Chicago with nothing but your son and your courage. You escaped Blackwood's trap through quick thinking and determination. You've built a new life from nothing twice now. Whatever happens, you'll find a way through it. With you, Catherine said fiercely. I want to find a way through it with you. Cole's expression was tender but resolute. And I want that too more than I've ever wanted anything. But first, we have to finish what your husband started. We have to make sure those men can't hurt anyone else the way they hurt you and Danny. Catherine knew he was right, but the knowledge didn't make the choice any easier. What if a year apart changes things between us? What if you decide you prefer the solitude, or I find that my feelings were just gratitude and fear? Cole smiled, and for the first time since she'd known him, it was a smile completely free of shadows. Katherine O'Brien, I fell in love with you the moment you asked me about honest employment for a desperate widow. A year apart isn't going to change that. A lifetime apart wouldn't change that. The words hung in the air between them the first time either had spoken of love directly. Katherine felt her heart soar and break simultaneously at the beauty and pain of this moment. Finding love just as circumstances demanded they be separated. "I love you too," she whispered. "I love you, and I love the life we built here, and I love watching Danny bloom under your care." "Then we'll have something worth coming back to," Cole said firmly, "something worth fighting for." Their kiss was tender and desperate, full of promise and fear, and the aching hope of two people who had found their other half just in time to lose them again. When they broke apart, both had tears in their eyes. "Mama," Danny's voice came from the doorway where he had been watching with the solemn intelligence that had become his hallmark. "Are we leaving, Mr. Mitchell?" Katherine knelt down to her son's level, gathering him into her arms. "For a while, love, we have to go help some lawmen catch the bad men who hurt Papa. But Mr. Mitchell will be here when we come back." Danny looked at Cole with worried eyes. "You promise you will be here?" Cole knelt beside them, his voice steady and sure. "I promise, Danny. This will always be your home, and I'll always be here waiting for you and your mama to come back to me." The next few hours passed in a blur of preparation and heartache. Katherine packed their few belongings while Cole worked with the marshals to arrange the logistics of their departure. They would leave that evening traveling to the nearest railroad under cover of darkness to minimize the risk of being observed by any of Blackwood's people who might still be watching for them. As the sun set over the Texas hills, Katherine stood on the porch where she had spent so many peaceful evenings with Cole and tried to memorize every detail of the view. The rolling pastures, the distant mountains, the big sky that had come to represent freedom and possibility. All of it would have to sustain her through the difficult months ahead. "I have something for you," Cole said, joining her on the porch and holding out a small wrapped package. Inside was a simple gold locket, old but well cared for, containing a tiny photograph of the ranch house. "It was my mother's," Cole explained. "I want you to have something to remind you of what's waiting for you here." Katherine fastened the locket around her neck, feeling its weight settle against her heart like a promise. "Thank you. I'll treasure it." "Mrs. O'Brien," Marshal Hayes appeared in the doorway. "It's time." The final goodbyes were almost unbearable. Danny clung to Cole with the desperate grip of a child who had already lost one father and feared losing another. Cole held him close, whispering promises and reassurances that seemed to calm some of the boy's fears. "You take care of your mama," Cole told Danny as he set him down. "And remember everything I taught you about horses so you can help me with the new colts when you get back." "I will, Mr. Mitchell, I promise." Cole's farewell to Katherine was more private, conducted in the shadows beside the waiting wagon where the marshals couldn't overhear. "Come back to me," he said simply, his hands framing her face in the darkness. "Nothing could keep me away," Katherine replied, then kissed him one last time before climbing into the wagon that would carry her away from the only happiness she had known in years. As they drove away from the ranch, Katherine turned for one last look at the man who had become her anchor, her hope and her love. Cole stood silhouetted in the doorway, a solitary figure against the warm light of the house they had made into a home. Katherine pressed her hand to the locket at her throat and made herself a promise. She would see this through no matter how long it took or how dangerous it became. She would help bring Patrick's killers to justice, and then she would come home to the man who had taught her that love was possible even after devastating loss. The months that followed were everything Katherine had feared they would be, and more. The federal safe houses were comfortable but sterile places designed for temporary residence rather than living. The legal proceedings were complex and emotionally draining, requiring her to relive Patrick's death over and over again as lawyers picked apart every detail of her testimony. Worst of all was Danny's gradual withdrawal back into the serious, frightened child he had been immediately after his father's death. Without Cole's steady presence and the freedom of ranch life, Danny began having nightmares again, startling at sudden noises, asking repeatedly, when they could go home. Katherine did her best to maintain their connection to the life they had left behind. She wrote to Cole every week, sharing the mundane details of their temporary existence and reading his responses aloud to Danny. Cole's letters were full of ranch news, gentle humor, and consistent reminders that he was counting the days until their return. But as the trials dragged on month after month, Katherine began to fear that she had made a terrible mistake. The defense attorneys were skilled and ruthless, attacking her credibility and painting Patrick as a disgruntled employee, seeking to damage his former colleagues out of spite. The financial records that had seemed so damning in Catherine's hands were dismissed as circumstantial evidence that proved nothing definitive. Worse, there were signs that the defendant's influence reached even into the federal justice system. Witnesses disappeared or changed their testimony. Evidence went missing from supposedly secure locations. The judge seemed increasingly reluctant to allow Catherine's most damaging testimony, ruling that it was hearsay since she had not witnessed the events herself. "I'm beginning to think we should run," Karen confided to Marshal Hayes after a particularly brutal day of cross-examination. "Take Danny and disappear completely. Start over somewhere far away." "Mrs. O'Brien," Hayes said gently, "I understand your frustration. These cases are always difficult, but we're making progress. The jury is hearing the truth even if the defense attorneys are trying to cloud it. And if the truth isn't enough, if these men walk free," Hayes was quiet for a long moment, "then we'll make sure you and Danny are protected. New identities, relocation to somewhere they'll never find you. It's not ideal, but it's better than living in fear." Catherine thought about Cole waiting faithfully at the ranch for a woman who might never be able to safely return. Would he understand if she had to disappear forever? Would he wait indefinitely for someone who could never come home? It was during the darkest period of the trials, when Catherine was beginning to lose hope entirely, that the breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Danny had been having particularly bad dreams, waking up screaming about the bad policeman and begging to go home to Mr. Mitchell. Catherine had been walking him around their safe house apartment, trying to calm him down, when he said something that stopped her heart. "Mama, I remember the numbers." "What numbers, love?" "The ones Papa wrote down the night before he went to heaven. The ones he hid in my toy horse. I remember all of them." Catherine stared at her son, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "Danny, are you sure? It's been almost a year since Papa died." Danny nodded solemnly. "I have a good memory for numbers, remember. Like when I helped you with the ranch books." The next morning, Catherine contacted Marshal Hayes with Danny's revelation. It took 2 weeks to retrieve the toy horse from their former Chicago apartment, but when federal agents finally pried open the hidden compartment in its base, they found exactly what Danny had described: a detailed list of account numbers, payment amounts, and dates that provided irrefutable proof of the pension fund fraud. Patrick O'Brien, sensing the danger closing in around him, had documented everything in a code that only his mathematically gifted son could remember. The evidence Danny had carried in his memory for almost a year was enough to convict not just the men who had killed Patrick, but the entire corruption ring that had been stealing from Chicago's police pension fund. The trials that had seemed hopeless suddenly became a prosecution triumph. Faced with overwhelming evidence and Danny's heartbreakingly clear testimony about his father's fear in the days before his death, the defendants began accepting plea bargains rather than risk lengthy prison sentences. Within 6 weeks, the last of Patrick's killers had been sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. The corruption ring was dismantled, the stolen money recovered, and Catherine and Danny were finally free to resume their interrupted lives. "It's over," Marshal Hayes told Catherine as they prepared to leave Chicago for the last time. "You and the boy are safe now. You can go anywhere, be anyone you want to be." Catherine looked down at Danny, who was clutching the toy horse that had held their salvation for so long. "I know exactly where we want to be," she said with a smile. "We want to go home." The train journey back to Texas felt like the longest trip of Catherine's life, though she knew it was actually shorter than their original flight from Chicago. Every mile brought them closer to Cole, closer to the ranch, closer to the life they had been forced to abandon. "Will Mr. Mitchell remember us?" Danny asked as the familiar landscape of Texas began rolling past their window. "Oh, love," Catherine said, pulling him close. "I think Mr. Mitchell has been counting the days until we come home." They arrived in Dusty Creek on a warm spring morning, 15 months after they had left under cover of darkness. Catherine had sent a telegram the day before, but she wasn't sure if it had reached Cole or if he would be able to meet them at the station. Her heart leaped when she saw him waiting on the platform, looking exactly as she remembered, but somehow more solid, more real, as if her months of dreaming about him had made his actual presence seem miraculous. "Mama, look!" Danny broke free from her grasp and ran toward Cole, who caught the boy in a fierce embrace that left no doubt about how much he had missed them. "Danny, Lord, how you've grown!" Cole's voice was thick with emotion as he held the boy who had become like a son to him. "I was beginning to think I dreamed that you and your mama were ever here." "We're back now," Danny said with simple confidence. "We're back for good." Cole looked over Danny's head to meet Catherine's eyes, and the love and relief and joy she saw there took her breath away. "Welcome home," he said simply, and Catherine knew that she truly was home at last. The ranch had prospered in their absence, but it had also remained somehow incomplete, waiting for their return to become fully alive again. Cole had maintained the spare room exactly as Catherine had left it, and the kitchen still held the cheerful touches she had added during their brief time together. "I was afraid you might not come back," Cole admitted that evening as they sat on the familiar front porch watching Danny play with the horses he had missed so desperately. "I was afraid the city might reclaim you, or you might decide that ranch life was too isolated after all." Catherine reached out and took his hand, marveling at how perfectly her fingers fit between his. "Cole Mitchell, there is nowhere on earth I would rather be than right here with you. You are my home, not the place. You are what I fought to come back to." "Then stay," Cole said, his voice rough with hope and vulnerability. "Marry me, Catherine. Let's build a real family together, the three of us. Let's make this official and permanent and unshakable." Catherine's answer was in her kiss, fierce and joyful and full of all the love she had carried in her heart through the long months of separation. When they broke apart, both were laughing through their tears. "Is that a yes?" Cole asked, though his smile suggested he already knew the answer. "That's a yes," Catherine confirmed. "That's a yes to everything. Marriage, family, forever." Their wedding took place a month later on the front porch of the ranch house where they had found each other. The ceremony was simple but perfect, witnessed by their neighbors and blessed by the vastness of the Texas sky. Danny served as ring bearer with solemn pride, and when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Katherine O'Brien finally became Catherine Mitchell's, in truth as well as in her heart. As the sun set on their wedding day, painting the sky in the brilliant colors that had first enchanted Catherine when she arrived at the ranch, she reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. She had answered a mail-order bride advertisement out of desperation and fear, seeking nothing more than a survival for herself and her son. Instead, she had found love, justice, and the kind of happiness she had never dared to dream was possible. She had learned that sometimes the most frightening leaps of faith led to the most beautiful landings, and that healing was possible even after the deepest wounds. "No regrets?" Cole asked, echoing the question that had become their private joke. Catherine looked at her new husband, her son, who was finally free from the shadows of the past, and the ranch that had become their sanctuary and their future. "Only one," she said with a smile. "I regret that it took tragedy and fear to bring us together, but I'm grateful for every moment that followed." And as the stars emerged in the vast Texas sky, Catherine Mitchell knew that she was finally truly home.